It is not clear when Chiang Kai-shek first learned to distrust permanence. The town he was born into, Jiko, a riverside market village in Zhejiang, did not feel temporary. It sold rice. It kept ancestral tablets. It repeated the same ceremonies every year. Yet China, at the end of the 19th century, was dissolving in ways that daily life could not quite register. Foreign gunboats anchored off treaty ports. Silver leaked out of the economy. The Qing court struggled to impose meaning on disasters it barely understood. Chiang was born in 1887, when the empire still existed but was already hollowed. Historians suggest that children raised in this period absorbed contradiction as a condition of reality. Order on the surface, erosion underneath.
His father, a salt merchant, died when Chiang was young. The record remains unclear on the emotional tone of that loss, but structurally, it mattered. A household without a patriarch in late Qing China was a destabilized household. His mother, Wang Kaiyu, became the center of gravity. She was devout, severe, determined that her son not drift into the disorder she saw spreading beyond their walls. Later, Chiang would speak of filial duty as a form of discipline rather than affection. It is difficult to separate personal memory from political self-construction, but the pattern is suggestive. Authority to him was not warm. It was stabilizing. It was the thing that prevents collapse. Shiko was not remote. Traders passed through. Ideas arrived in folded newspapers. Reformist rumors traveled faster than policy. By the time Chiang reached adolescence, the Qing dynasty was no longer a timeless fact. It was a problem. Intellectuals debated constitutional monarchy. Young men left home to study in Japan. Secret societies revived slogans about restoring the Ming. Chiang, however, did not begin as an ideologue. He began as a boy restless inside a moral architecture that felt older than him. He failed repeatedly in early schooling. Classical education did not suit him. The essays were ornate, the values abstract. He preferred something with edges. The military academy in Baoding became an escape route. Later, Tokyo would replace Baoding. But the movement outward started earlier, with the recognition that tradition was no longer a reliable map. The empire ended when Chiang was 24. It collapsed not with a single sound, but with administrative silence. Officials changed uniforms, flags changed. Most villagers did not immediately notice. But the young men did. They noticed that the center had vanished. Chiang's letters to his mother, preserved unevenly, show a man who returned mentally to Shiko even while physically moving away from it. He sent money when he could. He asked for moral advice. He reported failures more readily than success. Some historians interpret this as sincerity. Others see calculation. The cultivation of virtue as reputation management. What remains certain is that his mother represented a form of legitimacy he never found elsewhere. The new Republic of China, founded in 1912, did not provide that feeling. It existed mostly in proclamations. Power fractured into regional armies. Local warlords minted currencies. Railways became bargaining chips. Chiang observed this from the margins. He did not yet control events, but he watched the men who did. They were not idealists. They were brokers. Japan offered him something China could not: coherence. The Imperial Japanese Army Academy taught discipline, hierarchy, modern logistics. It taught that national survival required control of violence, not its dispersal. Chiang was not an exceptional student. He was not remembered as a theorist. What he absorbed was mood rather than doctrine. The decay was not solved by persuasion. The record remains unclear how much exposure he had to revolutionary socialism at this stage. He would later claim early loyalty to Sun Yat-sen, the Republican leader in exile. But the evidence is uneven.
What is clearer is that Chiang's nationalism formed as a reaction to humiliation, not from a blueprint. China had lost wars to Japan, to Britain, to itself. In Tokyo, he learned to see power as something technical, something that could be rebuilt if enough men obeyed. When Chiang returned to China, he returned to a country without a spine. The Republic had presidents, but no monopoly on force. Parliament met, but no one waited for its permission. Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary party, the Kuomintang, existed mostly in coastal cities and among exiles. Chiang joined it not as a visionary, but as a functionary. He organized, he enforced, he handled internal discipline. This was not glamorous work. It involved suppressing rival factions inside the movement. It required keeping accounts of weapons and loyalty. It trained him to think in terms of control rather than consensus. Sun Yat-sen noticed, not because Chiang was charismatic, but because he was useful. Shanghai in the 1910s was not a city. It was a composite of zones. International settlements enforced by foreign police, Chinese districts ruled by gangs, banks financed by overseas capital, revolutionaries hid behind shell corporations. Chiang spent time here, acting as Sun's enforcer. He negotiated with underworld figures. He arranged arms shipments. He shut down dissent inside the party. Historians disagree on how deeply he was entangled with criminal syndicates. Some describe tactical cooperation. Others suggest a deeper moral compromise. What is not disputed is that this environment hardened him. The revolution was no longer about removing the Qing. That task was already done. It was about surviving in a vacuum, and survival required alliances that could not be printed in party newspapers. By the early 1920s, Chiang was no longer a wandering officer. He was inside the core of the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen had begun reorganizing the party along Leninist lines, with help from Soviet advisors. Cadres were trained, loyalty was formalized. Chiang was appointed commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy near Guangzhou. This was not yet power, but it was a template. Whampoa produced officers whose first allegiance was not to province or clan, but to party and commander. It was here that Chiang first touched something resembling permanence. A disciplined youth cohort, a doctrine of unity, a controlled future. Yet even here, the ground remained unstable. The Kuomintang relied on Soviet money. It collaborated uneasily with Chinese communists. It spoke of national unification while surviving on external sponsorship. The contradictions did not trouble Chiang openly, but they accumulated quietly. There is no single document where Chiang states a personal ambition to rule China, but the structure of his actions begins to suggest it. He positioned himself at institutional choke points. He eliminated rivals methodically. He framed loyalty as morality. He cultivated the image of the soldier who does not debate. This did not yet make him dominant, but it made him indispensable. And indispensability is often the first form of power. China in 1924 was still a rumor. Maps showed borders, but those borders were aspirational. The people spoke dozens of languages. Armies answered to provincial financiers. Taxation was a negotiation. Chiang Kai-shek, the boy from Shiko, now commanded the training of the next generation of officers who would attempt to impose unity on this terrain. He had not yet unified anything, but he had learned to wait. He had learned to organize force without explaining it. He had learned to treat loyalty as infrastructure. What remained unanswered was whether this discipline would bind China together or simply replace one fragmentation with another, more systematic one. The question did not yet need to be resolved. It was enough that he was no longer drifting. The center was not there. But he had begun to imagine himself as the thing that might someday stand in for it. When power does not yet belong to you, every alliance is temporary. By the mid-1920s, Chiang Kai-shek stood inside a political structure that was both expanding and hollow. The Kuomintang spoke of national revolution, but it possessed no nation. It spoke of discipline, but depended on Soviet advisors to teach it. It spoke of unity, but survived through coalitions that made unity impossible. Chiang was not yet the face of the movement. He was its machinery. At Whampoa Military Academy, he shaped a generation of officers who owed their careers not to provinces or families, but to him. This was a technical achievement, more than an ideological one. It did not require speeches, it required systems. Students rose at the same hour. They drilled with the same weapons. They were taught to see disorder as a moral failing. In later years, graduates of Whampoa would occupy key positions across nationalist China. Historians often trace Chiang's eventual authority back to this moment, when loyalty was institutionalized before it was celebrated. But even this was compromised. Soviet advisors supervised training. Communist members were embedded within the academy. The Chinese Communist Party, still small but growing, had been invited into the Kuomintang under a United Front agreement brokered by Moscow. It was a marriage built on strategic necessity rather than trust. Chiang did not oppose it openly, but the record suggests he never accepted it as durable. Sun Yat-sen's speeches filled volumes. 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, people's livelihood. They offered a vocabulary for national resurrection. Chiang listened. He repeated the slogans. But his correspondence reveals a man increasingly skeptical of abstraction. He preferred to speak of training, rectification, purification. Words to him were less about mobilization than filtration. They separated reliable men from unreliable ones. After Sun's death in 1925, the Kuomintang lost its gravitational center. A committee replaced a figure. Ideology replaced charisma. Factions multiplied. Chiang maneuvered inside this confusion with restraint. He did not rush for the top office. He waited for disorder to create the need for an enforcer. In 1926, the Kuomintang launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign to defeat warlords and reunify China. Officially, it was a party effort. In practice, it required someone to command an army across fractured territories. That someone became Chiang. He did not inherit a disciplined force. He assembled one. He purged unreliable commanders. He centralized logistics. He insisted that party representatives follow military authority rather than the reverse. As the expedition advanced, cities fell not to revolutionary fervor, but to negotiated surrender. Warlords defected. Bankers switched sides. Local elites recalculated. This was not romantic unification. It was administrative absorption. Yet alongside this expansion grew a tension that could not be managed by hierarchy alone. Communist organizers moved with the armies. They formed unions. They seized factories. They spoke directly to workers and peasants, bypassing local elites. To Chiang, this was not partnership, it was infiltration. Shanghai was not just a city, it was an economy. Textile mills, dockyards, international banks, a labor force capable of paralyzing all of it. In early 1927, communist-led labor uprisings helped nationalist forces enter the city. On paper, this was success. In reality, it created dual authority. Workers answered to union leaders. Militia answered to party committees. Police answered to no one clearly. Chiang arrived to a city already half governed by people who did not answer to him. What followed is often called the Shanghai Purge. The mechanics remain debated. What is known is that in April 1927, nationalist forces, working with local gangs and business elites, moved against communist organizations. Union leaders were arrested or executed. Strikes were crushed. Communist influence in the city was largely destroyed. The Kuomintang split. The left wing, centered in Wuhan, denounced Chiang as a traitor to the revolution. The Soviets withdrew support. The United Front collapsed. Chiang did not issue a philosophical defense. He did not need to. He had chosen order over coalition. In the months that followed, Chiang lost ground politically. He was forced to resign briefly under pressure from rival factions. The party fractured. The Northern Expedition stalled. Yet something important had changed. The communists were no longer inside his structures. The army was increasingly loyal to him personally. When he returned to leadership later that year, it was not as a compromise candidate, but as the only figure capable of commanding the forces still moving north. The pattern was emerging. Chiang advanced not through victories that looked clean, but through crises that left others unusable. From this period onward, Chiang's worldview hardened. Allies were provisional. Ideology was a tool, not a compass. Popular mobilization was dangerous if not fully supervised. The record shows a narrowing of trust. He relied increasingly on family networks, sworn associates, graduates of Whampoa. Those outside these circles were not necessarily enemies, but they were variables. And variables, in Chiang's system, were not tolerated for long. By 1928, much of northern China was under nationalist control. Beijing fell. The old imperial capital was renamed Beiping to remove its symbolic status. China was not yet unified in practice, but it had a single government recognized by most foreign powers. Chiang Kai-shek became chairman of the national government. The boy from Shiko had not set out to replace the Qing emperors, yet he now occupied a space no emperor could have recognized. A republic built on military discipline, party doctrine, and administrative fear. He did not announce a new era. He simply assumed the role the disorder had created. What remained unclear, what he may not yet have fully understood himself, was whether the habits that had carried him this far were capable of sustaining a country rather than merely conquering it. The alliances were thinner now, the language of unity quieter, and beneath the surface of victory lay a system that had learned to survive by narrowing, not widening, the circle of trust. Power, once acquired, rarely feels like a rival. For Chiang Kai-shek, the late 1920s did not open into consolidation, but into acceleration. The nationalist capital moved to Nanjing. Flags were raised. Ministries were reorganized. Foreign governments exchanged diplomats. Yet, beneath the ceremonies, the state remained provisional. Warlords accepted appointments, but retained their armies. Provinces remitted taxes selectively. Banditry continued under different names. Chiang presided over something that looked like a government and behaved like a coalition. He responded not with decentralization, but with intensification. New committees were formed to monitor morality, education, discipline. Party membership became a credential for civil service. The army's command structure was revised to reduce the autonomy of regional commanders. It was an attempt to compress China into an apparatus. The question was whether the apparatus could hold. In 1934, Chiang launched what he called the New Life Movement. On paper, it was a moral reform campaign. Citizens were encouraged to practice hygiene, punctuality, orderly dress. Confucian virtues were blended with military discipline. It is often remembered for its rules: no spitting, no slouching, proper queuing. But historians suggest the movement was less about manners than about visibility. It sought to make private behavior legible to the state. A disciplined society, Chiang believed, would not need to be constantly coerced. It would self-regulate. Yet the movement exposed a contradiction. To enforce virtue, the government had to expand surveillance. Neighborhood associations reported on each other. Schools evaluated moral conduct alongside grades. Order was no longer just administrative. It was intimate. While Chiang tightened control in the cities, the Chinese Communist Party retreated into rural bases. After the 1927 purge, communist remnants fled to mountainous regions. There, they rebuilt, organizing peasant militias, redistributing land, experimenting with alternative governance. The most significant of these bases emerged in Jiangxi province. From Nanjing, this enclave looked marginal. It was remote, poor, surrounded by nationalist territory. Chiang launched a series of encirclement campaigns to destroy it. The first 4 failed. The Red Army adapted. It avoided set battles. It dissolved into the countryside, reappearing where least expected. It was not a contest of ideology. It was a contest of endurance. Chiang's military doctrine during these years was conventional. He favored large formations, fortified positions, decisive engagements. This made sense against warlords. It was less effective against insurgency. Each failed encirclement hardened his approach. He built blockhouses across Jiangxi, advancing inch by inch, denying the communists space to maneuver. The 5th campaign, launched in 1933, nearly succeeded. Under relentless pressure, communist forces broke out and began what would become known as the Long March. From Chiang's perspective, this was victory. The rural Soviet was dismantled. The enemy fled thousands of kilometers westward. Their losses were immense. Yet the destruction was incomplete. The communists survived. And survival, under these conditions, became a form of legitimacy.
Throughout these campaigns, another force pressed inward from the periphery. Japan had seized Manchuria in 1931 after a staged railway explosion. It installed a puppet regime and expanded its military footprint in northern China. Chiang protested diplomatically. He avoided large-scale war. This restraint has been interpreted in conflicting ways. Some argue he prioritized internal unification over external resistance. Others suggest he recognized the impossibility of fighting Japan before consolidating the state. What remains clear is that to many Chinese, the government in Nanjing appeared more invested in suppressing foreign Chinese than confronting foreign invasion. The tension between national sovereignty and regime survival widened. In December 1936, Chiang flew to Xi'an to pressure one of his generals, Zhang Shuiliang, to intensify operations against the communists. Instead, Zhang arrested him. For nearly 2 weeks, China had no clear head of state. Negotiations unfolded in fragments. Communist representatives arrived. Moscow signaled approval for compromise. The result was Chiang's release in exchange for a renewed united front against Japan. It was a humiliation disguised as diplomacy. He returned to Nanjing alive, but altered. The pattern of unilateral control had been interrupted not by ideological opponents, but by his own commanders. Trust narrowed further. In 1937, full-scale war with Japan erupted after clashes near Beijing. This time, Chiang did not hesitate. The government mobilized. Factories were relocated inland. Universities packed up entire campuses and fled west. Millions became refugees. Nanjing fell later that year. What followed there remains one of the most contested atrocities of the 20th century. The nationalist government retreated to Chung-cheng, governing from caves and provisional offices. Power no longer meant ceremony. It meant survival under bombardment. War transformed Chiang. He no longer dealt primarily with party factions or warlords. He managed scarcity. Weapons were rationed. Troops were undertrained.
American aid arrived inconsistently and often with conditions. His command style became increasingly centralized. He approved operations personally. He overruled generals. He rotated commanders frequently, wary of independent power bases. This ensured loyalty. It also produced paralysis. Field officers waited for instructions that came too late. By the early 1940s, Chiang Kai-shek was internationally recognized as China's leader. He met Roosevelt. He appeared in Western newspapers as a symbol of Asian resistance. At home, however, legitimacy was thinner. Inflation soared, corruption spread, soldiers went unpaid, civilians traded in black markets that no longer felt criminal but necessary. The communists, regrouped in the Northwest, expanded quietly. They avoided frontal conflict with Japan when possible, preserving strength. Chiang fought on two fronts, visible and invisible. What he could not see clearly was which battle was shaping the future. Power, once attained, had not simplified his world. It had only narrowed the margins for error, and error, in a country stretched between invasion and revolution, was no longer a mistake. It was a direction. Chung-cheng was never meant to be a capital. It was humid, river-choked, poorly mapped. When the nationalist government retreated there after the fall of Nanjing, it brought with it ministries, archives, factories, and a sense of suspension. The city expanded without planning. Refugees slept in temples. Air raid sirens punctuated days that were otherwise formless. Japanese bombers targeted the city repeatedly between 1938 and 1943. Caves were converted into offices. Government clerks learned to write memoranda underground. This was Chiang Kai-shek's peak influence. Not because he controlled China in any complete sense, but because no alternative center remained visible. The old coastal cities were occupied. The countryside was partitioned between insurgents and collaborators. Chung-cheng was the last address that could plausibly call itself national. Yet, this authority was thin. It rested on recognition from abroad and obedience extracted at home.
The nationalist state during the war years became a machine for triage. Transport was prioritized for weapons. Civilians bartered for food. Inflation erased savings almost monthly. The currency lost credibility. Gold and rice replaced paper as measures of value. Chiang responded with control. Price regulations were imposed, hoarders were arrested. Newspapers were censored to prevent defeatism. Historians note that these measures were often inconsistent and unevenly enforced. Local officials enriched themselves while issuing anti-corruption decrees. Military procurement became a private economy. Chiang was not unaware of this. His diaries reveal frequent references to moral decay among subordinates. Yet his remedies were structural rather than political. New oversight bodies, new regulations, new committees. He attempted to repair legitimacy through administrative multiplication. The National Revolutionary Army expanded rapidly during the war. Conscription was broad and often coercive. Rural families hid sons to avoid recruitment. Others bribed officials to secure exemptions. Those who were drafted arrived underfed, illiterate, and inadequately equipped. Training was rushed. Casualties were immense. Chiang's command style emphasized loyalty over initiative. Officers were rotated to prevent the formation of independent power bases. Promotions were as much about personal trust as battlefield competence. This ensured obedience. It also drained the army of flexibility. American advisors complained privately that Chinese units were capable of endurance but not maneuver. Chiang listened. He did not fully adapt. In his system, decentralization was a risk greater than inefficiency. Throughout the war, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party maintained a formal alliance. In practice, it was a ceasefire more than a partnership. Each side conserved strength.
Each side expanded quietly in zones the other did not monitor closely. Skirmishes broke out along unclear boundaries. Chiang viewed this not as betrayal, but as inevitability. When the war with Japan ended in 1945, the alliance expired without ceremony. Both sides prepared for the conflict they had deferred. Victory over Japan restored the nationalist government to international prominence. Chiang flew to meet Allied leaders. He was recognized as one of the victors of the war. But when the government returned to Nanjing, it returned to a country that had changed its expectations. The Japanese surrender had not brought stability. It had released a vacuum. Communist forces moved quickly into former occupied territories, accepting Japanese surrenders when nationalist troops could not arrive in time. Rural populations, accustomed to their administration during the war, often welcomed them. Chiang attempted to reassert control through transport and negotiation. American aircraft ferried nationalist troops north. Peace talks were held. Agreements were signed and ignored. Civil war resumed in fragments rather than declarations. Post-war inflation accelerated into hyperinflation. The currency collapsed. Urban middle classes saw life savings evaporate. Soldiers sold equipment to buy food. Black markets eclipsed formal trade. The Kuomintang was blamed, not for ideology, but for exhaustion. It could no longer promise order. Chiang replaced ministers. He issued moral proclamations. He authorized anti-graft campaigns that rarely reached the inner circle. The problem was not absence of policy. It was saturation of disillusionment. By 1947, the communists controlled vast rural regions. They implemented land reforms, often violently, redistributing property and mobilizing peasants into militias. Chiang's forces retained cities and rail lines, but they lacked the surrounding support structures that make occupation sustainable. Nationalist armies captured territory and then withdrew, unable to garrison it. Communist units filled the void. The pattern repeated until it no longer required explanation. In 1948, major nationalist positions in Manchuria collapsed. Entire armies surrendered or defected. The logic of defeat shifted from tactical to structural. Chiang dismissed commanders, replaced staff, issued new strategic directives. None addressed the underlying erosion of legitimacy. By early 1949, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Beijing fell. Nanjing was evacuated again. This time, the retreat pointed not inland, but outward, to an island that had been under Japanese rule for 50 years and had only recently returned to Chinese administration. Taiwan was not yet refuge. It was contingency.
Chiang Kai-shek did not publicly acknowledge defeat. He framed the withdrawal as strategic. The party would regroup. The revolution would be resumed. Privately, the diaries record exhaustion. Not despair, but depletion. The methods that had carried him from Shiku to Nanjing, discipline, loyalty, centralization, had not been enough to outlast an enemy that offered participation rather than obedience. As his government boarded ships for Taiwan, China passed into a new phase without him. What he carried with him was not simply a defeated army, but a model of power whose limits had been exposed. Whether those limits were personal, structural, or historical remained unresolved. They were merely postponed across a narrow stretch of water. Taiwan, in 1949, was neither homeland nor exile in any settled sense. It was a territory recently detached from Japanese administration, carrying the residue of empire in its institutions, its infrastructure, its schools. Mandarin was not the dominant language. The population had not experienced the decades of civil war that had shaped the mainland. Into this environment arrived the remnants of a defeated state.
Nearly 2 million soldiers, officials, and dependents crossed the Taiwan Strait in stages. They brought gold reserves, archives, artworks, and a political system that had lost its country. Chiang Kai-shek did not describe this as flight. He described it as continuity. The Republic of China, he insisted, still existed. It had merely shifted geography. Yet geography is not a neutral container. It reshapes authority. In May 1949, the nationalist government declared martial law in Taiwan. It would remain in effect for nearly 4 decades. On paper, this was temporary. In practice, it became the architecture of the new regime. Political parties were banned, publications were screened, security agencies expanded into every level of society. The stated purpose was counter-infiltration. The Communist Party, Chiang argued, had not abandoned the island, but the system that developed was not only defensive, it was preventative. Dissent was treated not as disagreement, but as rehearsal for treason. Thousands were arrested in the early 1950s in what later came to be known as the White Terror. Many were executed or imprisoned after closed trials. The records are incomplete, the charges often vague. This was not the chaos of wartime Chung-cheng. It was control, refined. Chiang governed Taiwan as a commander rather than as a president. Economic policy emphasized stability. Land reform, implemented with American assistance, broke up large estates and compensated landlords with shares in state enterprises. This reduced rural inequality and undercut potential communist influence. Infrastructure was repaired. Education expanded. Public health campaigns were introduced. These achievements are often cited as the foundations of Taiwan's later prosperity. Yet, they were embedded within a political environment that did not permit participation. Prosperity was administrative. Loyalty remained compulsory. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 transformed Taiwan's strategic position. The United States moved the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, effectively guaranteeing the island's security. Military aid resumed. Diplomatic recognition followed. Chiang was no longer merely a defeated leader in exile. He was once again a Cold War asset. This support insulated the regime from both invasion and internal reform. As long as Taiwan was positioned as a barrier against communism, questions about its governance could be deferred. For Chiang, this alignment confirmed an old instinct. Survival depended less on domestic consent than on strategic indispensability. In his later years, Chiang increasingly withdrew from public life. Decisions were filtered through a small circle of confidants. His son, Chiang Ching-kuo, assumed growing responsibility, particularly in security affairs. The younger Chiang had studied in the Soviet Union, married a Russian woman, and observed communist systems from the inside. His administrative style was more pragmatic, less doctrinal. Yet the transition was not announced. It was absorbed. Power passed not through election or debate, but through proximity. The family, which had once been a source of personal legitimacy in Shiku, became the vessel of state continuity. From Taipei, Chiang continued to claim authority over all of China. Maps in classrooms showed the mainland shaded in the same color as Taiwan. Children memorized the geography of provinces they would never see. Official speeches referred to the recovery of the mainland long after it had ceased to be plausible. This was not simply denial. It was a form of temporal control. By refusing to acknowledge finality, the regime postponed reckoning. The civil war was not lost. It was suspended.
Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975. There was no revolution in Taiwan that day, no public catharsis. The state functioned. He was mourned officially as the leader of a nation that no longer existed in the form he had imagined.
International recognition of the Republic of China had already been transferred to Beijing 4 years earlier. The world had moved. Taiwan, however, had not yet redefined itself. Historians remain divided on Chiang's legacy. Some emphasize his role in resisting Japanese invasion, in preserving a Chinese government through war and collapse. Others focus on his failures, the corruption he could not contain, the popular support he could not command, the authoritarian system he entrenched. What complicates judgment is that his life does not resolve into a single trajectory. He was not only the defeated ruler of the mainland, he was also the architect of a state that, in modified form, outlived him. Taiwan's later democratization occurred not because of Chiang's design, but within the structures he imposed. They constrained and they preserved. From the rivers of Zhejiang to the caves of Chung-cheng, from the academies of Guangzhou to the ministries of Taipei, Chiang Kai-shek moved through environments that were always provisional. He did not create stability. He enforced continuity. Whether that continuity saved anything essential or merely delayed the consequences of fragmentation remains an open question. He imagined China as a discipline that could be taught. History answered with something more diffuse. Not refutation, not vindication, only the persistence of a divide he could never close.